What exactly is the coolest movie of all time? Is it the punchy and off-plot Tarantino dialogue of Pulp Fiction?
This is a tasty burger.
Maybe it's the subtleness of the neo-noir thriller Drive, with its main protagonist developing a cult-like status among the terminally online youth. Or is it the laid-back and non-confrontational attitude of the dude in The Big Lebowski?
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Now, there are a few others that seem to be in the running here, some of which of equal or greater relevancy, but we're here to judge solely off of cool factor. So what is cool? Well, for starters, it's subjective. We all have our own perception of what cool is. For some, it means confidence, composure, or effortless appeal. For others, it implies a certain level of detachment or indifference, creating an aura of intrigue or mystery. It could be the anti-authority character who habitually goes against the status quo. It could be the charming ex-criminal who's been thrown into one last job. It might even be the seemingly average dude who unknowingly shoulders the fate of the world. It's an incredibly valuable component for almost any film, and I don't think it's even evolved much over the years. The same tropes are still as common as ever. One of my favorite films of all time is the John Wick series, which utilizes the timeless trope of the badass who's forced into ending his retirement. But these films play on this exceptionally well. The storyline and stakes don't seem too absurd despite it being, on paper, kind of insane. It's an underworld league of assassins who trade in gold and have headquarters within every major city in the world, utilizing seemingly everyday people who are collectively sworn to a code of secrecy. Compare this to the Fast and Furious series, which, to be honest, has lost its magic for me a few films ago. I'll still watch them. They're wildly entertaining, but if I suspend disbelief, I'm mostly doing it for the spectacle. The dialogue doesn't really strike me like it used to.
My father was a horrible man. Very bad daddy.
It feels a bit too on the nose and often cringe-inducing. The stakes in the first few films seem fairly reasonable. Dom wasn't this trained assassin, he was just some guy who could drive and throw a punch. John Wick's skill set was believable because we're given insight into his backstory.
We called him Baba Yaga.
He's had decades of training. Now, for Dominic Toretto to scale into this wildly talented killing machine over the course of just a few years just sort of takes me out of it. Any amount of cool he has seems fake. That and the dozens of action sequences that are about as believable as seeing Ed Sheeran in Game of Thrones.
It's a pretty song. I've never heard it before.
It's a new one.
Cool can eventually fade, and you become reliant on awe factor, which is, in my opinion, the cheapest form. Now, the John Wick series does utilize fancy cars and attractive women, but it's done with style and far more attention to detail. Within the Fast series, it feels more cosmetic, purposely put there to prop up any lackluster aspects. We're some dozen or so films in, and the franchise honestly feels like it could have ended 4 films ago. It feels like it's running entirely on fumes, but wow, sometimes fumes is all you need. Part of the cool factor in movies for me is maintaining some original idea or theme, the humanizing of its central characters. The Fast series does talk about family and helping one another, but it feels more like a crutch at this point. There's not much invested in it other than the nostalgia of having known these characters for over 2 decades. John Wick is able to effectively scale without losing its believability. The stakes increase with every film, sure, but John is still John. He's still haunted by the passing of his wife. He's still empathetic towards animals. He's just as feared now as he was in the first film. Death for any antagonist seems inevitable, but only after a grueling near-death experience for the hero. This vulnerability makes the one-liners far more enjoyable.
I'm thinking I'm back.
I don't find myself rolling my eyes at what would typically be a cheesy bit of dialogue if it were in any other setting, but theme and relatability is only part of the puzzle. A film is a 90-minute or so balancing act. It's far more difficult than it seems to make one, and from the critic's chair, you don't account for all the moving parts. I mean, try writing a script on your own. Try getting it past an executive, let alone funded. Now avoid letting it become diluted into a completely different story because the studio has a different creative vision. Most films, when shot for cool factor, end up going straight to Blu-ray, on demand, or in some theater overseas. It's why the vast majority of films nominated for Academy Awards aren't ever, if at all, centered around any semblance of cool. There's much more safety in drama. It's much less cringe to write more realistic dialogue, albeit it can get a bit boring. The ones that do opt for cool factor though and end up doing it well become cultural icons. shots. They're mimicked and replicated into the ground. Ask any film teacher or script editor what the first script most beginners in their class will turn in, and you'll usually get some dialogue-heavy, overly raunchy, and descriptive Tarantino copycat. It's as if they want to live vicariously through the characters, but cool films done poorly are almost never padded with an appropriate build-up or the necessary story arc. It's always just thrown in, which can be jarring if it isn't a consistently central part of the film's theme. Ocean's 11 is one of my favorite movies, and in my opinion, one of the coolest films of all time. In part because from beginning to end, from the opening jail scene to the silhouette of the crew in front of the Bellagio fountain, it's insanely cool. I mean, I could talk for hours about the witty and charming dialogue.
Does he make you laugh?
He doesn't make me cry.
The A-list cast, or the absolute banger of a soundtrack. But this film is made all that more memorable because it does this consistently and at a healthy pace. They're not oversaturating Bernie Mac's comedic timing and mannerisms. They're not forcing Brad Pitt to show his abs every 20 seconds. Tess isn't leveraging her beauty to sway some dull-witted security guard. Danny doesn't seem invincible. I mean, when we first see him, he's in handcuffs and at the mercy of our legal system. And the movie even ends with him getting sent right back to jail. His purpose for being there isn't even about the money. It's to stop the woman he loves from making a deeply regretful mistake in pursuing financial stability over true love. Danny Ocean's charm and wit adds a cosmetic shield of swagger to his character, but the viewers know of his genuine underlying incentives and just how vulnerable he really is. This makes him believably cool. This film also has a number of my favorite quotes.
Don't use 7 words when 4 will do. Don't shift your weight. Look always at your mark, but don't stare. Be specific, but not memorable. Be funny, but don't make him laugh. He's gotta like you and then forget you the moment you've left his sight. And for God's sake, whatever you do, don't, under any circumstance.
Russ.
Yeah.
They're all there to serve a purpose. It doesn't seem to force feed you with unfitting, witty one-liners, and at one point, Danny even makes fun of the trope itself.
Why do this? Why not do it? Because the house always wins. Play long enough, you never change the stakes, the house takes you. Unless, when that perfect hand comes along, you bet big, and then you take the house.
Been practicing this speech, haven't
A
you?
little bit, did I rush it? Felt like I
That
rushed
was
it.
good, I liked it.
But while Ocean's 11 is a juggernaut of cinematic cool, I don't think it's the coolest. Now, if you ask the crevices of the internet or certain Reddit boards, they'll almost all give you the same answer. And honestly, they might be onto something. I don't even know where to start with this movie or how to take it seriously when it's been hyper-analyzed and memed to absolute hell. But when you look past the satirical analysis and over-the-top praise, you start to appreciate just how unironically cool this film actually is. Ryan Gosling isn't normally championed for his subtlety, but if you look behind the rom-com castings, you'll find the actor has more skill than people may have initially thought. It's apparent in previous films like Half Nelson, where Gosling was forced to tarnish his post-Notebook good boy persona to play a teacher/addict whose attempts at saving a troubled youth end up failing miserably. It's an incredibly powerful film. So going into Drive, you'd have thought that Gosling's talent for subtlety would have been taken more seriously. Unfortunately, Crazy Stupid Love released the same year, which includes an A-list cast and a scene where Gosling is completely shirtless, blew Drive out of the water at the box office. So I don't know if it's the perception of him as a rom-com actor or his pretty boy persona, but people have a hard time admitting that this is one of the coolest performances ever brought to the modern screen. Now, I don't mean it's the most skilled or impactful. He's not exactly Daniel Day-Lewis. I've abandoned my child! But there's a cult behind this film for a reason, and it relies solely on the reserved attitude of Driver, who only seems to ever speak when it's absolutely necessary. Though timid, he's able to get the girl and be her protector. He has a strict code he lives by, and under pressure, rarely, if ever, falters. This man seems like a machine, and if it weren't for the subtle twitches or the nerves we see strike on occasion, we'd think he actually was. Driver is every timid teenager's fantasized perception of themselves. He's who every cubicle-dwelling 9-to-5er dreams of being. A man whose days are filled with mundane routine. One who lacks the social skills to either get the girl or be a functioning, productive member of society. But he does it anyway. And I can almost guarantee you that as the sun sets, there's at least 10 cars in your immediate area blasting Kavinsky's Night Call on their drive home. But it's not just the storyline that makes this film so cool to me. Noir is timeless in Hollywood. It's been around since the dawn of cinema and has been utilized constantly brilliantly over the years by directors like Michael Mann, Quentin Tarantino, Guy Ritchie, and Edgar Wright. But what makes it so appealing? This cyberpunk atmosphere creates this fantasy of being a night owl. This idea that while everyone else is asleep, you're busy living. It's why there's an overwhelming sense of comfort every time I see a scene with a late night diner or a shot where the protagonist is the only car on the road. The night feels lawless. There seems to be no rules past a certain time. It feels as if you're free to come and go as you please. Perhaps it even tugs on the nostalgia of wanting to stay up late as a kid, or maybe because as adults, we usually aren't supposed to. It's more responsible to get a great night's sleep, to wake up at an appropriate time, to follow the status quo. And though it may seem juvenile, what's cooler than resisting that? Drive utilizes this night atmosphere and its color scheme to convey that same feeling. It adds an edge to every scene. Driver, while not exactly a monster, is still an active member of the underworld who daylights as a regular member of society. Having just enough morality, he's someone we can live vicariously through, having neither the means or the boldness to do what he does. This appeal is heightened by the fact that he's never actually given a name, a cloak of anonymity that gives us inclination to look deeper into his character for answers. This lack of insight draws us in. It's what makes him cool. Neo-noir has been around a long time, and some of the coolest films have come from the genre. Michael Mann's Heat, the John Wick series, LA Confidential, and Blade Runner, to name a few. But these films draw heavily on the colorful cinematography and emotion from the score. There's one director who's been able to both pay their respects to films past while simultaneously revolutionizing the genre. And if you had to guess, you're probably right. Tarantino wasn't just inspired by a film or two. He never tried to recreate the wheel. He simply watched an ungodly amount of classic films, some dozens of times over. He studied them, debated them, and even pitched them. I mean, if there's any successful director you could look at and think, oh, well, that was kind of inevitable, it's this guy.
I always knew I was gonna make a film eventually, someday, some way, by hook or by crook. And so eventually I did.
The man who's been religiously obsessed with film since his childhood, whose favorite films were all made before most of us were even born. Tarantino lived, breathed, and studied an era where masculinity reigned supreme. The 60s and 70s were flooded with copious amounts of anti-establishment and edgy cool. And while Tarantino wasn't exactly Casanova himself, he knew it like the back of his hand. His magnum opus, and in my opinion, the coolest film of all time, was Pulp Fiction. Tarantino is known for his free-flowing dialogue. Part of the appeal of Pulp Fiction for me is the character's nonchalant attitude towards the severity of the situation. Jules and Vincent are preparing to do a job, and the conversation shifts from weed to cheeseburgers. Tarantino dialogue feels like it doesn't give a about the audience. There's no pandering here.
If you get stopped by a cop in Amsterdam, it's illegal for them to search you.
It doesn't take itself too seriously, as is the case with a lot of filmmakers. He tends to have simple answers for why he does things.
Why the need for so much gruesome, graphic violence? Why not let us imagine
Because it's so much fun, Chan. Get it?
Leaving the audience to interpret meaning, perhaps more than he initially intended. This is odd to me because most filmmakers are incredibly eager to make you think they're the next big thing through overly artsy subtlety. Create enough confusion and you'll be the talk of the festival circuit. You'd think it's because he has the luxury of being well funded and doesn't have to tease with overly deep symbolism or meaning. But this dialogue was present in his debut film Reservoir Dogs. Now it could just be that I'm not the most insightful critic. I'm not Thomas Flight or Nerdwriter, but there's something about the simple violence and seemingly throwaway conversation that I really like in Tarantino films. They're almost like a little treat in between the major moments, a break from the exhaustive hyper-analysis. Now I know you're probably thinking I should just go have a Steven Seagal marathon if I don't want to do any critical thinking. But that's the thing, there's plenty of symbolism in a parade of nostalgia references. At complete surface level, it serves as an incredibly comfy watch filled with the perfect blend of violence, humor, style, and storytelling. The non-linear narrative also makes this film completely unpredictable, warranting another 2 to 3 watches before you feel like you're fully up to speed here. These feel like real people. I've seen this film easily 10 or more times, and every new watch there's an Easter Easter egg I haven't seen or a nostalgia reference in plain sight. The 70s was a decade of fads and crazes, from Marcellus's turtleneck and frames to Mia's bangs to Jules's jerry curls. You get a sense that Tarantino is extensively aware of what the average person was like back then. There's no bell-bottom pants or disco balls throughout the entire film, and it pays respects to the era without the crutch of a cliche. Tarantino is also never one to indulge in fan service. He just makes what he wants. Pulp Fiction became a cultural juggernaut because they were the best of his extensive film knowledge put together. Dozens of references to classic films, all made entirely at his direction, and it wasn't diluted by the ever-invasive hands of Hollywood executives. When you allow for an individual's full creative expression, you get something new and refreshing. If you allow for a number of people's creative input, it becomes a generalized mess that attempts to appeal to a wider audience while attracting none. You can't please everyone. And in the words of Oscar-winning Hollywood screenwriter William Goldman, nobody knows anything.